Hello again, National 5 pupils. It's Mr. Kinnear with another video lesson for National 5, Unit 3, Life on Earth. We're looking at Key Area 3.3 today, Energy in Ecosystems. In previous lessons, we've talked about food chains, and you know by now that food chains show the flow of energy in an ecosystem. If you see an arrow in a food chain or a food web, then that is energy being passed from one organism to the other. We should know as well that the sun is the source of the energy. That's captured by plants and it's then eaten by animals, and then those animals may get eaten, and so on and so forth. And again, we've talked about all these different words within food chains and food webs, but the key thing we're looking at is the energy. Is the energy passed on, say from a producer, in this instance, a green plant, grass, going on to the primary consumer? That's a herbivore, or particularly a caterpillar eating that grass. Those caterpillars are then eaten by a secondary consumer, which is a carnivore because it's eating just animal material. It's a sparrow. And a tertiary consumer, the sparrowhawk, which is also a carnivore. But does that sparrowhawk, the tertiary consumer, get all the energy from that green plant, the producer, right at the start of the process? The simple answer to that question is no. Energy is lost from a food chain through process like heat. So energy is used by the organism when it generates heat. So there's a heat map of a couple of ostrich there. They are generating heat within their bodies. Again, movement. So any organism that moves will use up energy from its food by moving, and that's not passed on, that's lost from the food chain. And again, this is an example of an owl pellet where it clearly contains some material from what it's eaten that's not been digested. So the energy in there has not gone into the owl, it's ended up in its waste material. Although that undigested material and the other waste products will be lost to that food chain, it's not completely lost to the ecosystem. So waste products in dead organisms are decomposed. Their nutrients and their energy are then released back into the environment, into the ecosystem, and can be recycled and absorbed by plants. The main organisms involved in decomposition are fungi and bacteria. So the three main ways we've got of energy lost: movement, heat, and undigested material. There's only a very small amount of energy that's actually passed on from one organism to the other within a food chain. That's only about 10% of the energy from one trophic level gets passed on to the next. So from producer to primary consumer, from primary consumer to secondary consumer, and so on. But that energy, that 10%, is the energy the organism has used for growth. So bulking up, adding on extra cells, extra bits of tissue, all of those things to make the organism bigger as it goes through its life cycle, that energy is kept within the organism, and therefore if it's eaten, then that's the energy that that animal has consumed that will then pass on to the next trophic level, the next organism within the food chain. So let's put that into numbers with one of our previous food chains. So producer, our green grass, is producing 10 kilojoules. So joules being the measure of energy, I'll say kilojoules being 1,000 joules, just as in kilometers is 1,000 meters. And that could be over a period of time per square meter of grass. And only 10% of that is passed on to our primary consumer. So 1,000 joules, or you could call that 1 kilojoule. And 10% of that, 100 joules to our secondary consumer, our sparrow. And then again, 10% of that, so just 10 joules for the tertiary consumer. So as you can see, as you go along the food chain, we're losing 90% of that energy. So the tertiary consumer at the end of that, fourth down the line, is not getting a huge amount of energy, a very small proportion of what was produced right at the start. That will have an impact on the size of the organisms and the number of organisms that it can look after as you go up the food chain. And we'll come back to that at a later stage. We can then put that into a diagrammatic form, a pyramid. So this is a pyramid of energy. It shows the total available energy at each level within a food chain. So like we talked about, 10,000 joules at the producer level, going right down to 10 joules at the sparrowhawk level, losing 90% of the energy as we go up each step of the chain. So we put that into percentages, then obviously the producer is producing 100% of the energy. 10% of that at primary consumer level, 1% of that at secondary consumer level, and then only 0.1% at our tertiary consumer level. And as you can see in both of these two pyramids of energy, then the smaller the bar at each level, the smaller the amount of energy shown within that. So that's why it's a pyramid, because normally you're seeing this reduction in size each step you go up, obviously making it a pyramid form. Let's look at another food chain so we can start to think about the numbers. So we've got algae to water flea, stickleback and pike. Some of you may not be 100% familiar with stickleback and pike, but obviously it's a smaller fish, and pike is quite a vicious fish. It takes a gutsy fisherman to go fishing for pike, especially to catch one and try to get your hook out of its mouth, because it really could take a finger if it really wants. It's got really powerful jaws, so it's a really big fish. So that then gives us an indication about the size. So algae, tiny microscopic organisms, incredibly small, going up to a really large organism. So that's what you'd normally find within a normal food chain in general. And in terms of numbers, then again, be thousands or millions of these microscopic organisms. The algae to a very few amount of pike. They'll be incredibly territorial. They'll be obviously trying to stave off competition from their other pike for food and for mates, etc. So again, there'll be very few pike at the top of the food chain. So generally, that's what we'd see. The numbers reduce and the size increases as you go through a food chain. So that then helps us get an understanding of the pyramid of numbers. So pyramid of numbers is a diagram showing the number of organisms at each stage in the food chain, and that generally does form a pyramid shape as well. So we have algae, water flea, stickleback and pike as per that previous food chain. So that's again what we saw in terms of the shape of a pyramid, like the previous one, pyramid of energy. Sometimes, however, pyramid of numbers produce really odd shapes, so not a classic pyramid shape. Let me show you some examples where it doesn't give you a really good indication of what's happening within the food chain. So for instance, an oak tree, one oak tree can sustain a huge amount of insects, and therefore those insects can sustain a smaller amount of woodpeckers, the secondary consumer. Or we've got lots of grass able to sustain a good number of rabbits, but those rabbits can sustain a huge amount of fleas, because again, the fleas are very small, so a big number of fleas can live on one rabbit. So again, with both of those, we've got really odd shapes, not classic pyramid shapes that you'd see sitting in the middle of Egypt. So we might have to do something about that to make sure we've got a pyramid that really shows what's happening within a food chain. And that's where we'd use a pyramid of biomass. So if weight or the mass of the biological material was used instead of numbers, then the pyramid shape is restored. So this is a slightly different example than one we had on the previous slide, but same kind of thing with an oak tree at the bottom. Once we've converted that oak tree into biomass rather than numbers, then it starts to make a bit more sense. Still only one oak tree, but that still has a huge amount of biomass that can sustain a smaller biomass of caterpillars, again a smaller biomass of blue tits, and then a small amount of sparrowhawks, which have shown up quite a few times. And the unit of biomass is grams per meter squared. So that's another way of doing things. Again, nature is not always as simple, because we do get seasonal changes. So populations have short lifespans, and therefore they have this massive bloom. So whether it's algae or flies, or again, as you see in terms of winter time when the trees lose all their leaves, things like that. So the biomass can be massively different from season to season in certain organisms. And that's it for today. We have looked at energy being lost at each level of a food chain. through heat, movement, undigested material, and some of that undigested material and waste products are then decomposed by bacteria and fungi and put back into the system elsewhere. Only the energy used for an organism growing is passed on to the next level, and that's only accounts for about 10% roughly of the energy. We can then demonstrate food chains with different pyramids, so pyramids of energy, numbers, and biomass, to try and help people make sense of what's happening within the different food chains. So hopefully that's been helpful. If you have any problems, questions, or queries, obviously give me a shout and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.